Hey, this is Mr. Mitchell with a second video on Australia. Go ahead and do the questions. Down at the bottom is the sources. You do not have to write down the sources, but if you can write down these 5 questions and try to answer them during the course of the video. Okay, let's take a further look at Australia. It was 1788 whenever British convicts first were sent to Australia. You may remember that was why Britain had colonies in Australia. Very flat, very dry, probably not a paradise like people would think of some places. But that's exactly what happened. It was 1788 when British prisoners were first brought. And you can see kind of the route that was taken. It took off in 1787 in May. The ship went all the way down to South America, ended up going to the south of Africa, 1788 by then. Or I guess that should be 1787 because it was January of 1788 when they finally reached Australia, almost a year later. You imagine what kind of trip that would have been. But anyway, here is another depiction of the Australian continent being discovered. I guess you say it wasn't really discovered because the Aborigines were there. But you have the Europeans that brought these ships of prisoners into Australia. Well, anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about Australia. A majority of Australians consider themselves Christian, but not as full a majority as you might find in other parts of the world. You know, in South America you have almost 100% Christian and Catholic. In Central America, it's kind of the same thing. Even in the United States, you probably find a very high percentage that would be considered Christian. But here you only find about 61%. So that's a majority, but not an overwhelming majority. And you will also find a bunch of different kind of churches, which is not as true in the rest of the world. Now, here in the United States, we have a bunch of different kind of churches. But of the places we've studied, it's predominantly the same kind. Here you have a big Catholic church, and Catholic church is the predominant church. See, the figures I have here is that Catholicism is about 25% of the people that have churches. So you can imagine if the highest percentage church is 25%, that you really don't have one church that is really the predominant church there. Unlike American countries where there's a high, I already mentioned that. Well, anyway, the literacy rate is very high. It's one of the highest in the world. I looked it up. It's the same literacy rate we have here in the United States. It's 99%. So 99% of the people in Australia can indeed read and write. No. Can indeed read and write. We do have in Australia a constitutional monarchy. Now you may remember that a constitutional monarchy is where you have a king or queen. And the king or queen, well, they don't really have that much power. You do have a constitution. Here's the Queen of England, who happens to be the head of state of Australia as well as Canada. But she doesn't really have any powers besides ceremonial powers. They do have a parliament type system where there's a Congress like we have. They do have a prime minister. So it's a lot like Canada, very, very similar to Canada. In fact, the prime minister is named Julia Gillard. I have not heard her name, but I have just seen it in print. So I'm presuming that you pronounced her name Julia Gillard. So she is the prime minister. The first female prime minister of Australia, by the way. Britain became interested in Australia in 1788 as another way to get goods across the world and to relieve overcrowding in their jails. And here you can see a picture of a convict that apparently is going over to Australia. Inhabitants already there were the Aborigines. They had no written language. Here's a photograph, a more modern photograph, because you do see a knife, and you interestingly do see a cross here. So this is a more modern photograph of Aborigines. But the Aborigines that were there had no written language. They didn't wear civilized clothes, and some places didn't have clothes at all. They didn't build houses, they just lived on the land. So the British viewed them as a nuisance, or at best for them a source of free labor. So you may remember that it was a long time before Aborigines even got the simple rights of citizenship. It was like 1960 when that was the case. France and the Netherlands had already Britain was not the first country to Australia. France and the Netherlands had already come there, but France and the Netherlands found it too dry, too arid, just not a very pleasant place where they landed. But one thing that Britain ended up doing, Britain ended up landing around here on the east coast. And you may remember from the previous video that you do find water at the east and northern coasts a little bit more, so it's probably a little bit more livable there. And I think that's probably why you ended up having Britain settling it instead of other places settling it. Britain happened to stumble upon that eastern coast, which is a little bit more livable. Now, Australia has 6 states. You know, we have 50 states, they have 6 states. And you can kind of see the boundary lines here. You have that huge one out west called Western Australia. You have South Australia here, the Northern Territory here, Queensland here, New South Wales here. Now you can't see the dividing line here, but you do have a small province that down below New South Wales here. So you have 6 states. Now the population of Australia is pretty small. I mentioned that the population of the United States is around 300 million. Population of Mexico is around 200 million. Brazil is 200 million. Mexico is 100 million. Canada is 33 million, I believe. Australia is 22 million. So way, way smaller than the United States, way smaller than Brazil, way smaller than Mexico, and not even as large as Canada. It is one of the wealthier countries around. Of course, you don't have much population, but it is 5th in the world as far as wealth goes. And you can see it takes me a while to draw 5th right there. There is a celebration called Australia Day. Australia Day celebrates the bringing over the prisoners. Now, it seems kind of odd that you would celebrate the bringing over of the prisoners, but what that did was it did bring people to Australia. So Australia celebrates its Australia Day on January 26th, as you can see right here. So January 26th is the yearly Australia Day. I guess you could relate it to July the 4th for us. You see you have flags here and school children dressed up in a little Australia mask. I'm trying to remember what this picture is. Oh yeah, these are some of the cities right there, and we'll get to that in just a second. So January 26th was the date of the first group of prisoners to arrive in Australia. Just like in the Americas, Britain sought to ended up bringing diseases. Britain ended up bringing diseases, just like just like Spain did with coming to the New World in the Americas, and many Aborigines ended up dying. Just like in North America, the Aborigines were collected in the 1800s and moved inland. Now you may remember that many Aborigines move inland anyway, but kind of like the North American Indians, At some point, the European settlers just took them and moved them out west. And kind of the same thing happened here. It's amazing how history kind of repeats itself in different places, how the people who were not seen as the accepted people were just moved out. And you can imagine how difficult that must have been. The four largest cities in Australia are right down here: Melbourne, Brisbane, Sydney, and Perth. And as far as population, you have Melbourne, which has about 4 million. Let's see, what else do I have in my notes? Looks like Sydney has about 4 million. Looks like Brisbane has about 2 million. And Perth has just a little bit less than 2 million. I'm showing 1.8 million. How do these compare to U.S. cities? Not anywhere near the size of large U.S. cities. New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Houston, Atlanta are all far bigger than these cities. But I will show you what some of these cities look like. In fact, that's what these pictures are. Here is Melbourne. And you may remember some of the pictures we had of like Rio de Janeiro, and some of the pictures we had of like, oh, what am I doing here? Well, some pictures of like Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, and you have these huge skyscrapers just as far as you can see. But that is not the case here. Here you have in the largest city in Australia just a few skyscrapers. Let's take a look at Sydney here. I believe that is the next one. Yeah, here's Sydney. Now, Sydney is famous for having its Sydney Opera House. You can see it happens to be right there. That was in Finding Nemo, the Sydney Opera House right there. You also had, let's see, what else? See, I do believe it was Brisbane, which happens to be next. Here is what Brisbane looks like. And once again, you can just see kind of flat land and just a few skyscrapers. You see a stadium down there. And here is Perth. Perth happens to be on the west coast. All the others happen to be on the east coast. One other thing I want to talk about in this video is the boomerang. The boomerang is a curved flat stick that's thrown either as a weapon or a toy. Now, we think of a boomerang as a toy. And you can see what one looks like right here. But the Aborigines were the ones that came up with the boomerang. And they had decorations on it. And many of the boomerangs were ones that looked a little bit funny because they did not return. Now, the boomerangs, they're supposed to return to you, or at least the toys do. But you can see how these are a little bit different right here. The Aborigines primarily used non-returning boomerangs. A spinning boomerang can hit a target with more force than a thrown rock can. They were used for hunting and for fighting. And if you have a well-thrown non-returning boomerang, it can travel about 650 feet. Can you imagine if you get a good spin on these, it can really have a lot of force to it if it can be thrown 650 feet. Aborigines also gave these handy sticks other uses: skinning animals, digging holes. Some were used as currency in trades. Some were used for decoration, containing these ornate designs that were related to legends or traditions. And a boomerang was even used in some religious ceremonies. And they were even clapped together to provide a beat for singing children's songs. Well, I hope you've learned a little bit more about Australia. Don't forget to do the questions.